cloud. And then we will officially start. Hello, hello, La Scuola community. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Fong, and I'm one of the co-committee leads for the DEI committee. And tonight we have, Paul and I met very shortly and very quickly. I was just saying we are going to be best friends for the rest of our lives. A little bit about Paul David Terry. You all have seen his bio. He is currently the Assistant Director of Special Interest at Cal Augie Alumni Association. They are also completing their doctorate in international and multicultural education, amongst like 10 other things. But the coolest thing about them is that I like to believe that you're a music maker. So Paul sings in a community choir, sings opera. They do a thing called cymbaling. I also like to call them a multicultural cuisine foodie, because that's what they like to do in their spare time. Is cooking is their meditation. And this is the one that really got me, is that they're a bit of a rosé connoisseur. They like to consume rosé while they're playing croquet. So amongst that and all these other amazing things, we were hoping that Paul can come in tonight and share with us the topic that we've a lot of our families have asked for, is around critical race theory. And when I extended this invitation, they're like, yeah, I'll do it only if I can say what is critical race theory and why is it important holding a critical awareness analysis. So with that, I send it over to you. Let me know if you need me to screen share or anything, and I pass the mic to you, my friend.
Thanks, Fong. Yeah, if you can do me a favor and give me screen share access, that'd be great, so I can show the presentation. Thank you. I totally forgot some of those things are or sometimes were on my Twitter handle or other spaces online, so you can find those there. Rosé and croquet are such a great pleasure. UC Davis is a research institute about wine and beer, so it's essential as part of the job here. As Fong is getting that access, oh, here we go. We have access. So can everyone see that? And Fong is going to help me out with the chat feed. So if you have any questions during this time, please just put them in, and I'm happy to stop during this. So tonight we're going to talk about what is critical race theory and the importance of critical awareness. We'll touch up on what critical race theory is not, but thinking about other things that we can do. I wanted to start off by doing a land acknowledgement. So today we acknowledge the Ramaytush Ohlone Tribal Nation and the Patwin Nation. I reside here on Patwin lands and La Scuola with Ramaytush lands where we all occupy. While land acknowledgements bring awareness to the people who have experienced genocide, stolen lands, and knowledge, I also want to hold space that we go beyond the land acknowledgement. And so thinking about how we can think about Indigenous peoples as not being what is usually understood as grieving ghosts or artifacts, but communities that are doing the best that they can given what they have been given. So one thing that we can do to be in better relation is just knowing the lens that you occupy. And you can do that by simply texting your city and state to this number to think about where in the continental United States you have that. Also thinking about the activities. So in the Bay Area, we have the Two-Spirit Powwow. So Bates.org, great place to support their things. And thinking about Indigenous people as being the caretakers of land and how you can support through land initiatives as well. I also wanted to give a Black Lives Matter acknowledgement too, based on David Ralligan's work on truth-telling, decolonial human rights education in the movements of Black liberation. A great article, very long article, but to sum it up, so 3 things that I think are really critical in here. I was thinking about that when we talk about Black lives in this country, is to think about how Indigenous people were revoked of property and Black people were made property. And that has a long-lasting legacy. And so it's really our job to think about the moral inventory that has happened prior to here and the inequality and injustices that have happened. And that's when we can start thinking about truth telling, about history, about reparations and what that means. And for us to go forward to really unsettle that colonial mentality, which causes harm to Black and Indigenous folks across these lands, which is an integral part of the long struggles there. So a little bit about me. So I got into doing this working at UC Davis Health. I'm actually a UC Davis alumni, working in population health, managing integrative medicine, really asking the questions about who is really experiencing the high rates of disparities, particularly those that are experiencing them due to inequities of basic education and such. And that's where I jumped on to the UC Davis Health Advisory Council for LGBT people, where we really advocated. UC Davis was the first to put sexual orientation and gender identity into an electronic health record. And we've been really asking the question of how do you adopt these things? Why is this important? But even thinking down to the simple points of how education is so important. I helped to map out the first LGBT 101 education program at the health system, thinking about how we train front-end nurses. And a lot of that really inspired me to do the work that I'm doing going forward with my education. So as Fong mentioned, I'm doing my doctorate in international multicultural education with an emphasis in both human rights and racial justice education. Thinking about how we adopt education, thinking about how we advocate across identities, but also how we're in relation with our own identities as well. And this has really led to a lot of my research experience where I'm helping to build out and partner with the Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation Center at UC Davis Health, where we're talking and doing racial inequities, particularly thinking about what's happened with nurses and healthcare workers during COVID and social justice inequities, thinking about the exhaustion people are experiencing. And so over there, I've been facilitating a lot of racial healing circles over the last couple of years, but really thinking about how we train people to be advocates across identities, which is really tough. There's not a lot out there, surprisingly. We're really centered on individual identities, but no one's really connecting the dots or the spaces in between identities. And that's a lot of where I look, and hopefully we'll bring today to some of the stuff that we'll be talking about. So a little bit about this presentation. So we're going to talk a little about what is CRT, critical race theory. Then we're going to move into from critical race theory, which is really all based about in law, which spoilers, that's really the basics of CRT. But instead, I'm going to think about multicultural education rather than CRT. Then we're going to talk about how you can advance your own education. And one of the best ways is through critical awareness. You might have heard of critical consciousness through Paulo Freire. And so this is just the same thing. It's just hyper awareness, but thinking about how we move through the world. And lastly, we're going to talk about our own journeys, how you can think about how you walk through this world and ways to advance around all of these subjects. So what is critical race theory? Well, it started in law in the 1970s and 80s. You might have seen some of the names that have been thrown around, like Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, and Richard Delgado. It's an academic concept of more than 40 years. It's really centered there. And in fact, most people don't have critical race theory education until they either get to law school and take it as a subject. I think actually Berkeley's law school, now it's mandatory that you have to take this before you graduate. Or in my degree and profession, it's part of thinking about racial justice in education. It's not necessarily that we're directly applying or using critical race theory, but we're thinking about the areas around it that are bringing more awareness on how we can go forward. And we'll talk about that a little more. But again, it's an academic concept. It's a core idea that race is a social construct, really separating that race and ethnicity are two different things. It's embedded in our legal system and our policies. As I mentioned in the beginning, in this country, the legal system either said you were not smart enough as an Indigenous person, so we are going to take away your lands, or you are from Africa or have one drop of Black blood, and so we will label you as property. And that's really at the center of what critical race theory has analyzed and how those legacies and laws have moved forward. It also says that in critical race theory that racism is a part of everyday life. So whether you're white or non-white, and you might not intend to be racist, nevertheless, you're still fueling the idea that these policies, these laws, these structures around us are still going forward. And so it doesn't matter how you act or react, it's still around us. So, a lot of this centers on like asking, like, does race matter? What does it mean to be white or non-white? What does that mean in these constructs? It asked, if you have one drop of blood, of African blood, you are Black. But if you don't have enough of indigenous blood, does that mean you're not indigenous? And you don't afford the benefits that the government applies. And that's what critical race theory is. What is not, is it doesn't call people out for being racist. It doesn't call people out for, causing harm, but it's just really quantifying how it is around us. But there are a lot of lessons that we can think about to draw from there. But one thing that I'm really think is interesting as we think about critical race theory as it is in education, let's see, here we go. Beverly Daniel Tatum talks about the educators across the country, most of whom are white, are teaching racially mixed classrooms without important interpretive frameworks to help them understand what is happening in their interactions with students. And we're talking about trying to be in relation with Indigenous people, with Black people, with any identity you're thinking about, but not opposing those without the tools of understanding how to advocate. That's where multicultural education comes in. So we're moving away from these systemic things of critical race theory. And that's where I want to go to next, is how we can think about, we can think about points in critical race theory, but how do we move forward in a way that's really supportive of how each of us try to advocate and do our best? So first, let's think about applying critical race theory. So critical race theory is grounded in the experience and knowledge of people of color. So when I'm doing research around this, I'm really thinking about, what does the dominant view say about people of color, and what do people of color actually say? But it's also thinking about my positionality as a white identified person and thinking about the influences and the interpretations that happen in that. We think about the stories that are connected. So stories that have been used for thousands of years by Indigenous people as data points, and how we adopt those. We think about those in the racial healing circles, that the practices were invented by Indigenous people, and the practices from people of color, and how we use those, but not how we're bogarting. Like, we're really conscientious of are we stealing or are we honoring? And this is how we can develop new theories. So when we're talking about the work that I do in education, it's thinking about how I can be in relation to critical race theory, but it's a very complicated thing. I let legal scholars deal with critical race theory, and I sit with these things. But it can be such an inspirational thing. I think one of the fascinations I have is, so if anyone has seen Black Panther and thinking of the world of Wakanda, that is a great example of seeing a story that is told of what it's like for an African population to not be impacted by colonization. And then what you get are these imaginations, these reimagining of what these stories and people could or have done. We reimagine them from being those relics or grieving ghosts into actual people. And I think that's one of the best things we can do about moving from critical race theory, thinking about the scholar, these systemic things, to really thinking about how we view people, particularly people in color. Now, I want to take a walk through just the terms critical race theory, starting with theory. Bell Hooks, says one of my most favorite things from her book, Teaching to Transgress, is that she came to theory because she was hurting. She wanted to comprehend, to grasp what was happening within her and around her. she also wanted to make the hurt go away. A hurt that I see so many people impacted when we're talking about people being called racist or really feeling like they're doing their best, but doing something wrong. And she talks about finding that location for healing. And I think that's so critical. But she also says, and I think this is really true from at least the work that I'm doing and others, is that really coming to the other side of knowing and figuring this out really comes from the people who dare to create theory from the location of pain and struggle, to experience, to teach, to guide, and to chart new theoretical journeys. And this work is liberatory. And, as you saw with the photos and all of these other things, when we center around like multicultural education and we start thinking how we're in relation to it, it can be such a liberatory process. I also want to think about our positionality of racism, the definition. One thing I hear a lot is people will label things racist or think about race as equal to ethnicity. But how do you define race and racism? I think that's a really great place to start, is to, critical race theory has race in it. How do you see critical race theory? And I think part of that is through how you define it. Most of us don't really define that, but this is one first step that when we're talking about reparations for Black and Indigenous folks and what that looks like, have you also asked that? Really defining those things are going to take us into a first step of knowing how to approach a conversation. If we don't know what race or racism is, or we haven't actually thought about how to define it, then how can we actually start approaching and do better? The last part is just really thinking about multicultural education as a way that identifies language that helps us understand. So you could see that a multicultural lens will give you the words that you need and the tools to start going forward. It establishes that language that helps us make sense of what's going on. I imagine many of you have thought of like, what is critical race theory? And you're like, what does that mean? Maybe you've looked things up, but that's what multicultural education does. It's going to help you figure out what that means and how that fits into everything around you. Creates a lens which we can observe and interpret our social lives. I use the term in relation a lot. It's, thinking about how we're in relation to tribal nations, how we're in relation to queer people. We might not be within that identity, but we can get close, and that's just through basic education and compassion. And multicultural education is how we understand to be in relation, as I said, to race and racism. Now, the first part I said was in critical race theory was critical, and I think that's a really great thing we need to think about, and we could do that through the lens of critical awareness. Paulo Freire says he recognizes the connection between the individual problem and the experiences in the social context in which they're embedded. So thinking about how we are in relation to these social contexts of race and racism. Have you ever actually thought about that? I imagine if you start thinking about that, you're going to start experiencing pain and emotion. And as you're doing that, that's really what critical thinking or critical awareness is. It's in our bodies, it's in our actions and reactions. And by using critical awareness, we're actually thinking about how we act and react, but how we intervene in order to make change. And he goes on to say, it's absolutely essential that the oppressed participate in the revolutionary process with an increasing critical awareness for their role as subjects of the transformation. That means that it's not about us dictating how things should go, but being aware of who is at the table and who has the experience to understand how to lead path forward. Critical awareness is just putting us in a frame that we're understanding how these things play out, but we're also understanding how our emotions fit into this too. And coming back into the beginning of that truth telling, emotions and truth are very different things. And how do we segment that so we're doing the right thing? Moving towards critical awareness, regardless of our good intentions, we sometimes cause harm in spaces, and that's going to happen. But sometimes that happens just basically from a lack of racial literacy or awareness or conscientiousness. So, that is really on each of us to take the next steps to actually go forward and do something. Prior harm and cumulative harm from experiences in the past can impact how we approach a situation, can actually cause fear in some places where you don't actually interact. We see that a lot in healthcare, that when doctors, nurses, or front-end staff are not familiar with another identity, sometimes they don't say anything because they're fearful of actually causing more harm. And then the patient doesn't actually get any service because the health provider is like creating that barrier based upon their ignorance or fear of the unknown. Lack of practice and dialogue. So it takes a lot to do this work and to actually converse back and forth. I would say that, I have taken critical race theory in other classes. It is very difficult. It is very hard. And I do this work and I do the presentations over and over again, just so that I can get the practice of how to speak about this and how to be in relation, particularly when I'm advocating across identities. And that fear is just, it's terrible. Again, with the example in healthcare, being fearful of doing the wrong thing can really trigger a lot more harm for someone. So, you got to be brave in this. You got to be compassionate. You got to be humble. And those are critical things when that are needed when you're doing critical awareness. I want to reflect on Daniel Heath Justice, who talks about being beautiful to ourselves and that loving self-awareness. It's a hard thing to come by in a world that sees Aboriginal people as historical artifacts, degraded vagrants, and grieving ghosts. To take joy in our bodies and the bodies in relation to others is to strike out against 500 years of disregard, dismissal, and disrespect. And to think about how our bodies, when we are thinking about how we're in relation to other people, can be such powerful conduits for change, particularly when we're in such loving self-awareness with ourselves and our surroundings. I come back to cultural competence, and which was created in healthcare, thinking about populations and population health. It starts with attitudes, and there we learn knowledge, and then we learn skills, and there we learn awareness. And it kind of goes in this cycle. But even this process can have its discourse with DEI. And we see that even in healthcare, as we see about cultural competence, it can have, it can perpetuate racism. Ruth Shim, who is a faculty at UC Davis, talking about the social determinants of mental health, thinking about what really impacts health and people of different populations. But all in all, she was really trying to say psychiatry has been racist for quite some time, but could not name that. And she finally said, enough is enough. I'm quitting psychiatry because of the racism that is here and that we can't talk about it. And that's when we actually started seeing change in healthcare. And this was just in the last 2 years. That even in healthcare, trying to do its best is still protecting the systemic racism. And these are lessons that we can see that are transferable from critical race theory. We can also see other systems where this is in. So racism in technology. Rua Benjamin talks about the new Jim Crow code, that we are the builders and the makers and the systems around us. And if we are inherently biased, particularly towards race, towards gender, towards queer people, towards those with disabilities, it can actually impact the way and perpetuate this without us knowing. And we see that in so many ways. We see that, let's say, in the GREs. So the GREs were shown to be biased towards women and minorities. We saw this in the Apple Card. The Apple Card was released and we saw lower scores were being given to women and people of color. Why? Because the algorithms were built that way. And just this week, there's a great article, you can listen to it on NPR, about this computer science who talks about when she was in graduate school, she was looking at this facial identifier. And when she put her face as a Black woman in front of it, it couldn't identify her. She put on a white mask and it could. So you can see how these algorithms are really based about who builds it, why are they building it? But if we continue perpetuating these algorithms, they're going to perpetuate the bias that is part of them, part of the structure. The last part I want to highlight is how we journey through all this. This is a lot. There is a lot here. There's a lot to take in. There's a lot to process. So how do we do this? First, we can talk about, how we move through cultural competencies. So we start with cultural awareness, which is understanding that culture exists around here. And then you go forward with cultural sensitivities. So start feeling and thinking and acting around this. And then you get to cultural competence, which is the thing that I learned or I mentioned around healthcare. But the thing about cultural competence is we take a class, let's say about queer people or Black people or Indigenous people, and you're like, check, I've done that box. Now I go move on. But that's going to only perpetuate stereotypes over time. So researchers in the 1990s, after the Watts riots, developed a term called cultural humility, which is where you maintain these interpersonal stances around culture, but it's about self-reflection and lifelong learning. It's such an ongoing process. It's never done. The moment that we think we're done, we go back into cultural competence, and it's just checking off boxes, which over time are going to change. So one thing that we can do through our journey is really have humility for ourselves and others in this process, thinking about that self-reflection, and that it's always lifelong learning. What lifelong learning means, I think, is different for everyone. It could be taking a class, it could be attending something but it's always just doing something to learn. Can you learn everything? Oh gosh, no. Can you imagine like how many courses you'd have to do a year just to learn about one population, let alone everyone else? I would not put that on anyone to do. Just do your best, but be conscientious of what you're doing and how you're doing. So I really like the idea of adopting personal norms. So thinking about things that you could do for yourself. So one, just being present and engaged in this action, being able to just like be open to ideas. The next one is understanding and listening with compassion rather than the ego. So for people who go through grad school or all these other things, you often push through ego. And in this space, you have to throw the ego out. You have to check that over. And that can't be the way you approach this stuff. If you don't, you're just not going to do the learning. You're not going to do the listening. And that's just not how it needs to be approached. I love this one, assume positive intent, but also assume responsibility for your impact. So you might say something wrong, but don't turn around and make this all about you afterwards. Go out and do the work. Don't make this about them suffering from your ignorance. So think about what you're doing, but also think about the impact of what you're doing. Think about confidentiality. So someone might tell a story. That's really their story. In Indigenous cultures, we honor story and we think about other stories, but it's not my place to tell other people's stories. That's really theirs to share. Experience this presentation as part of a longer journey. So thinking about cultural humility, this is just one stage that you're going on, but you can have any learning process anywhere in the world at any moment. Move up and move back. So thinking about when you need to move up and ask questions, or if you're asking too many questions, it's time to move back. Or if you're more of an introvert, some days I'm more of an introvert than extrovert. I'm going to be more observant, but sometimes I got to take the leap and ask some brave questions. And lastly, centering on grace, bravery, and humility is really key. Two more things, and then we can take some questions. I am really fascinated with researchers in Wisconsin who developed the prejudice habit model. It's thinking about racial justice and racial bias is really a habit. It's thinking about you have to have like the spheres of influence. You have to have the continual education. You have to think about how habit is into your body. But I also think about like, if we have such trouble as society with habits around diet and exercise and all the other things, how the heck are we going to do a habit around racial bias? I mean, that's really connected to the heart and spirit. And so when you're thinking about trying to do better, think about like how you're growing, but also look back and see where you've gone. I think that's something to have grace with too, is that we're always progressing. It's difficult, but see how this is part of that journey. And that's the last thing I want to end on, is the concept of journey. So Sandra Stiers writes in Literacy of Lands, this concept that Indigenous people have used for thousands of years, thinking about journey, where the learner goes back to where they came from, or they set out across a very treacherous looking rapids and turbulent waters to the other side of knowing. In this process, we're always trying to get to the other side of knowing, but it is hard. It is really hard. You know, fear, anxiety, uncertainty, they creep into the confidence of the learner of what we have previously known. We're really faced with these insecurities all the time. But, you know, as we're overloaded with these senses, we still have to press forward, or we're carried away by fear. The fear or myths of stereotypes that have been until now, they have been informed of what we've known. So it's really on us to really face those fears, to think about those treacherous waters, and to find our own journey to that other side of knowing, which is where we're trying to get to in this whole process. So that's what I have for you all, really thinking about where we were with this concept of critical race theory, but really how we can go beyond that, and also how that impacts us in our own journeys.
Thank you so much, Paul. I would love to invite folks, if they have any questions, you can drop it in the chat, or, you know, come off of mute. And I just want to say, this is truly inspiring. I'm so inspired by Scott and their family over there. I'm like, I should have like propped this up on my TV too, so then our whole family can like be sitting here. So thank you so much for that idea. And I see your scholars sitting there with you. So yeah, just really want to open up the floor for folks to ask questions, and please jump right in.
I don't have a question, but I did just want to say thank you, that I also found this really inspiring. Love everything that you shared, and just appreciate the school bringing us together for this, and for your time. Thanks.
Thank you.
Oh yeah, thank you so much. This was wonderful. I wanted to ask if you had any examples of the habit breaking strategies that you might be able to share.
Sort of. So a lot of the I'm happy to send over like the researchers. They've been doing a lot of work, but a lot of the work is really in small groups, but thinking about the spheres that are around them. So it's not just about like the habit itself, but after you go home, like, are you able to like go against the flow, or do you have other people supporting you in that? And with racial bias, it's like everywhere in society, and like I mentioned in critical race theory, it's systemic, it's everywhere. So that means that as you're breaking the habit, it's really tough. So a lot of the interventions are really individual, small one-on-one, rather than bigger things. But they do offer trainings. So those are things that I can send over. But actually, this has been like a hunch with my own research, is that we don't really teach people to be advocates across identities. We tend to like, here, take the course on queerness, take the course on Black and Indigenous people, but how do those intermix, and how do we go forward to be able to leverage those? But also sometimes we're not even in relation with our own stories. Like we often think that just because we're one identity, we must know this, but can you imagine thinking about that in like LGBT people? Like a lot of queer people might not know about trans people or bi people or lesbians or this. And so it's really taking that analysis back of like where you are in your story. It's really complicated.
Yeah. You know, something, if nobody else has a question at the moment, something that you're making me reflect on, you know, talking about reparations, and, you know, where do we start from that? And these are systemic level problems, you know, and looking out. So, but how can we, in the institutions that we're in now, like does it make more sense to start small? And I'm thinking of an example of a church back on the East Coast that came to found, like, you know, did some truth telling and found in its own history that it had owned several, enslaved several people. And it was actually one of the priests there found out that his family was doing that, and one of the parishioners, who was a Black woman, that you know, and they were friends, and they found out that they had these histories, and the church made a decision to use its funds to start giving reparations. And I was just wondering if your institution, or if you know of any local kind of institutions that are taking the, you know, because we keep waiting on the systemic level and it's just not happening. And I'm just wondering if you have any examples, or if your institution's doing that. Just wondering how we can actually start making change when it's not coming from the systemic level, the government.
Thank you for that question. Yeah, I do have an example, but I would start with, you know, in this presentation, sorry, the sun is setting right on my nose tip, so I'm going to move this back. But, you know, that's one thing I really wanted to use this presentation for, is to say that, you know, it's complicated. There's a lot out here. I teach an anthropology course that's specifically on the evolution of sex, thinking about sex and gender in society and how it's evolved. And we can't deconstruct bias until we know what it looks like. So that's really on you to start thinking about what it looks like. But now that you know what it looks like, then let's start seeing how it's in our system, and then how you can figure out how to advance equity in that. One really good example. So I am a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, and something that I am so beloved too. And if you haven't been following them, in the last few years, the Black freemen who were slaves of the Cherokee people have just gained full Cherokee Nation citizenship. And so this has been a really great example of thinking about what reparations look like, because now the Cherokee Nation is really reconciling what it means to have owned slaves, have had this integrated into society, and also offering full benefits as a Cherokee Nation citizen going forward. It's a very complicated process. I mean, it's not something we can answer at any point. But I think just being aware and coming back to the critical awareness part is, when you start reading about these, you can start understanding a little more what that means. If I have a family member that, you know, wants discourse around this, and their views are opposite of mine, a lot of times I will center on, ask them, like, do you know, what is your definition of race and racism? Or what does reparations mean to you? And most of the time they can't answer that. And then I ask, well, why not? If we're all about trying to find equity and equality and all of these things, but you haven't asked those critical questions, how are we supposed to get there if you don't know where to start?
Paul, we have a question I dropped in the chat. I think, thank you for saying that. And Melina, I would tell you, I'm currently doing some work in OUSD around reparations with my organization. It is so hard. It is so hard. It takes so much energy. Half the time people want to give up, including our own organization, because there's just so much pain. And then to what Paul says is that we're constantly going back to that question of, like, what is race and racism, and how we have to constantly define it again as a group and as an individual group. We are beginning to see some movement. I would love to share with you, like, what that is like, but I would say that that's one pocket in Oakland right now that they're trying to do work in. And it's going to be a long contract. I'm going to be there for a long time, because we're undoing a lot of really, a lot of hurt. Paul, the question here is, how do you measure the success of education in CRT?
Ooh, well, so CRT is really just a tool to say, like, it exists here. So that's really what critical race theory is. Like, the theory is, like, these things are happening with race and racism. So I don't know, like, if you're talking about success in education, like, did we explain CRT right? Or are we using CRT? I think for me, I see CRT as just really another tool to use in different components of education. You could also think about, like, with CRT is, like, are we aware of racial bias within our system? leveraging CRT, but I wouldn't say that CRT is measured. Like you wouldn't say, yes, we are CRT proficient
Right.
in your system.
You also said, I think what you made the connection earlier on one of your slides, you had said that, you know, the start of critical awareness for someone is like understanding racial literacy, which is a conversation our committee has been having for a while, because at La Scuola, we do have a racial literacy curriculum. And I often share in this group too, is that I find myself blown away and extremely challenged by the conversations that my young one comes home with. You know, it's like, I know it in the way the adult speaks, and then he comes home with it. I'm like, oh, okay, we're doing that today. And, but at the very same time, his critical awareness, his analysis is so there. It's, and so I'm seeing that even that one slide that you were saying, in order to hold strong critical awareness is like, one step is racial literacy. And I'm like, oh, okay, I see that connection now. And it's just fascinating to make that connection, because you know, he and I are on parallel tracks, but of course we intersect. I'm learning, he's learning, we're learning together.
I also think like the measure of success is really like, have you improved on your journey? Have you gone forward? Are you recognizing what's happening? I have a lot of friends who have kids in junior high, high school, who are coming to me and they're like, Paul, my kids keep telling me I'm racist and I'm trying their best. And I was like, I know, because their awareness is a little higher than yours. It's not that you're doing your worst or you're causing this on purpose. It's just that like they're hyper aware of how this is in our system because we're talking about this more. And so probably a measure of success that you could see with this is that you start thinking about this and actually talking about this more. Talking about and having racial literacy is a really difficult process because this is, again, connected to our egos, our bodies, and we don't talk about this enough, or we're always talking this about from a deficit perspective,
Right.
not thinking about joys that are attached to this. And it can be exhausting. And so as you're thinking about, kids coming back with this higher rate of critical awareness, maybe a measure of success is that you're actually taking classes and you're doing your best and you're actually better than you were a year ago. That is such a profound measurement right there that we don't have enough grace for. Like I said, you can't learn everything. Like there is no one, not even my faculty. We actually talk about and really center on the fact that we're not experts in this. We're just people who are taking you on a journey. We might have read more, but we haven't read everything.
I love that. I took a session with you where you talked about that we are, each and every one of us, we should be collectors of stories.
Yes.
Not repurpose them. And only through collecting stories can we build our compassion and cultural humility. So I remember you saying that. And I'm like, yes, you're so right. You can read so many books, but they don't have the stories when you're talking to people.
When we think about how we're in position with other people, it's to think about how powerful their stories are as data points for our own learning, but being exceptional caretakers of their stories.
Yeah.
It's not about us, it's about being caretaker for them. And when we start moving into that frame, then we can actually start thinking about community and caring for each other and really getting past, this whole thing of calling each out for this and that. There's a concept in this country called US exceptionalism, where we blame other people without looking at ourselves. And I think this is just something that is if we don't get past that, if we don't think about how we're in relation to other people, we will never get past this whole concept of race and racism.
Right. We have like 3 generous, spacious minutes left before we hit 6:30. So I just want to see if there are any folks who have any questions. Sally, I just saw you unmute.
Yeah, no, I was thinking, hi, Paul, David, I'm Sally. I'm Director of Teaching and Learning at La Scuola, but also a parent of older children. I've been in a variety of classrooms, these lovely children at La Scuola, and what I'm making a connection back to the topic of these stories. And so this, we know how much children enjoy sharing their stories. And if we're discussing maybe a topic, they're making those connections through their family. And so they're telling their family stories. And so I think one objective of us as educators is sharing these other stories we've had, so then they can stretch a little further in their repertoire of stories and make the connections of people and parts of history they haven't lived, but they can find those connections. So we can use that story to kind of make a much wider canvas or broader, collection of stories, and the children are doing it in multiple languages. So I really appreciate that part. So thank you. And the whole presentation. Thank you very, very much.
You reminded me of a research project. I got a small fellowship to the concept of drag performance. There's Drag Queen Story Hour, which goes into schools and reads books. But I'm working with them to create trainings, but to think about how we're in relation to parents, to schools, and to storytelling. But we also step back to think about the concept of drag performance. When we're on Zoom, we're all doing the same thing. We're not really our same person. We're all here performing for each other. And so we think about like how we're actually doing that to leverage stories and storytelling, but really to center about like how we can create play and fun spaces where people can explore around identities and not feeling that hurt. And that's what we're coming into relationship with, is how do we think about those stories through this lens of play, of dress up, of being free to do whoever you are. It's a very new concept that I'm working with our parent group at USF to think about how we can advance our own knowledge as people and advocates, but also how we go into schools to be able to talk about stories without feeling like apprehension and fear.
Thank you so much, Paul. It is 6:30, everyone. I know that we can probably continue this conversation, and I want to invite you all that if you have additional questions, to send them to Malina or myself, and then we'll get them over to Paul, and maybe we can have Paul come back for other things. And there's so many Zoom links y'all can like jump on. There's so many things you can all be doing right now. And thank you so much for engaging this conversation. And Paul, thank you for coming in and sharing your knowledge and your heart. And I didn't even ask you, will we be able to get access to your slideshow?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. So then we will like post it on Constella and send it out in the Bulletino. So then the folks who could not join us will have access to it, and folks who are here will also have access to it. So I would love to invite you all to come off of mute if it's possible, so we can hear our voices, say good night, good evening, before we pour a glass of rosé ourselves and log off.
Thank you so much, Paul. This was amazing. We really, really appreciate it. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And give David a big hug for us, okay?
I will.
Tell him we miss him. Tell him to come around.
I get to actually the queer pedagogy one. I'm working directly with him, so he and I are
lucky. Okay, give him a big hug for me. Tell him. All right. Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Good night, everyone. Thank you so much.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Ciao. Thank you.